CySA plus simulation question, domain 1, threat and vulnerability management, part 4. So we are still on domain 1, threat and vulnerability management of the CySA certification exam. This domain is worth 22% of the questions. So together with the last domain, domain 4, incident response, this is one of the biggest domains. So those two are actually, no, the biggest one is 3, security operations and monitoring. But again, you know, the domain 1, threat and vulnerability management, still it's a big domain, to 22% of the questions. So we're still there. This is part 4 of this series of simulation questions. Question 31. You need to perform a vulnerability scan for all servers in the research department's subnet. The servers all use IP addresses in the 10.1.1.2 through 10.1.1.10 range. These servers contain highly confidential data. You need to identify the correct scanning parameters for the servers. Match each configuration on the left with the appropriate scanning setting on the right. So the query is as follows. The sensitivity level has to do with the assessment scan. So, which is basically, you will move this to this side over there. The scope basically means the range of IP addresses that you need to scan for vulnerabilities, right? And the authentication method basically means a credential scan in this case. Because remember, one of the key points of this is that this service contains highly confidential data. The sensitivity level is the type of a scan, whether it is, you know, discovery scan or an assessment scan. The scope is the range of computers that you want to scan, as we just talked about it. And the authentication method in this case should be credentialed because the servers contain confidential data. A discovery scan simply provides an inventory of discovered hosts. An assessment scan will actually assess all the hosts based on the criteria given, such as an IP address. And a credential scan will use login credentials of a privileged account to assess data that is protected by access control lists, ACLs. A non-credential scan would be unable to scan certain areas on the hosts. Question 32. You have been asked to perform a vulnerability scan on all desktop computers used by the sales department, which are located throughout the network. You do not have a current inventory listing of this computer, so you decide to perform a discovery scan. Which scanning criteria have you already determined based on the type of scan being performed? The correct answer here is C, sensitivity level. You have determined the scan sensitivity level because you are performing a discovery scan, which is used to create an inventory of assets based on the host or service discovery. You have not determined the scope of the scan, which is basically the range of hosts or subnets included in the scan. The scenario is specifically stated that the computers are located throughout the network. You have not determined the data type, which is based on the data classification levels or on the file extension. Basing a scan on a data classification level will scan all data at the classification level across assets, such as all confidential files. Basing a scan on data file extension will scan all files of that type across the assets, such as all .doc files for, let's say, Word documents. You cannot determine the vulnerability feed. A vulnerability feed includes the update to the vulnerability scanner that ensures that the scanner is able to recognize newly discovered vulnerability. Nessus refers to these feeds as plugins. You must periodically update your vulnerability scanner to have the most up-to-date vulnerability feed. Question 33. You have been hired by your company as a security analyst. You discover that a vulnerability management process was never established. You need to implement an information security vulnerability management process. What is the first step that you should complete? The correct answer here is B, identify requirements. The first step of implementing an information security vulnerability management process is to identify the requirements. The steps of implementing an information security vulnerability management process are as follows. 1. Identify requirements. 2. Establish a scanning frequency. 3. Configure the tools to perform the vulnerability scan. 4. Execute the vulnerability scan. 5. Generate reports. 6. Implement remediation. 7. Ongoing scanning and continuous monitoring. Question number 34. Recently, your network suffered an attack that was unsuccessful. As a result, you are reviewing the access control list on the routers. Which of the following is not a recommendation for ACLs? The correct choice here is C. Never include a permit statement in an ACL. Never including a permit statement in an ACL is not a recommendation, because if you do not include at least one permit statement in the ACL, you might as well shut down the interface because no traffic will be allowed. There is an implied deny all rule at the end of every ACL, and therefore you must specifically allow any traffic that needs to be allowed. It is recommended to block incoming IP addresses that have a private IP address as the source. These are always spoofed packets, as private IP addresses are not routable on the internet. It is recommended to block incoming traffic that uses the ICMP protocol. This should only be allowed inside the network, if at all. It can be used to perform some stages of topology discovery. It is recommended to allow responses to requests that were initiated from inside the network. Since this traffic is a response to a connection initiated from inside the network, it should be saved. Performing router and firewall ACL review will help you to determine why certain traffic is being allowed or denied. Remember that the order of the rules in the ACL will affect the communication as well. Question 35. As a security analyst for a U.S. government body, you must implement a vulnerability scanning rate that fits within the confines of the Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA. Of which scanning factor is this a part? The correct answer here is A, regulatory requirements. The Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, is a part of the regulatory requirements that affect the vulnerability scanning rate. All laws and regulations that affect the organization must be fully analyzed to determine their effect on the scanning rate. Risk appetite is the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept. A higher risk appetite would translate into a lower scanning frequency, while a lower risk appetite would translate into a higher scanning frequency. Technical constraints include any constraints that are in place that may limit the scanning frequency, such as performance or licensing limitations. Workflow is the flow of transactions and processes that affect the scanning rate. Question 36. After completing a vulnerability scan, John received a report that no vulnerability existed on a Windows workstation. Later, John discovered that the workstation had a vulnerability in the operating system that was not caught. What type of error occurred? The correct answer here is B, false negative. The type of error that occurred is a false negative. The vulnerability scan indicated no vulnerability existed when in fact one was present. A true negative is when a vulnerability scan reports no issues and no issues exist. A true positive is when a vulnerability scan reports a vulnerability that does not exist. And a false positive is when a vulnerability scan reports a vulnerability that does not exist. Security analysts should analyze reports from a vulnerability scan. This involves reviewing and interpreting scan results. As a result, security analysts need to identify false positives, identify exceptions, and prioritize response actions. Question 37. After performing a vulnerability scan, you receive the scanning report. A CVSS vector is provided as part of this report. For one of the vulnerabilities, you need to determine which metric measured may be a concern. The CVSS vector for this vulnerability is, and again, so we've gone through this kind of questions before, but as a review, so this is the attack vector, which in this case is it's network. The access complexity here is low. The authentication is none. The confidentiality is complete. The integrity is none, and the availability is none. So which metric has a value that you should not be concerned with? So if you do not understand at this stage, what these metrics are, then you should review. There was one of the earlier questions in which I explained what all of this means. So if you still do not understand this, then you need to review that topic over there. The correct answer here is A. So you should not be concerned with the value for the availability metric. The availability A metric describes the disruption that might occur if the vulnerability is exploited, and it has three possible values. N, which stands for none, it means that there is no availability impact. P stands for partial, it means the system performance is degraded. And C stands for complete, and it means that the system is completely shut down. And for this metric, N is the best ranking. So if you look at these questions, you look that basically all the other metrics are you should be concerned about it. because the as we saw, the attack vector it was low. The authentication, it's known, basically mean that an attacker can authenticate without, can enter a system without authentication, and the access complexity, I believe that it was low as well. But anyway, so the only one that it was not of concern on this question was the availability metric here. Question 38. You are your organization's security analyst. Recently, you discovered that an attacker injected malicious code into a web application on your organization's website. You discovered this attack by reviewing the log data on the web servers. Which type of attack did your organization experience? The correct answer here is A, cross-site scripting. Your organization experienced a cross-site scripting or XSS attack. A cross-site scripting attack occurs when an attacker locates a vulnerability on a website that allows the attacker to inject malicious code into a web application. A persistent cross-site scripting attack occurs when data provided to the web application is first stored persistently on the server and later displayed to users without being encoded using HTML on the web client. A non-persistent cross-site scripting attack occurs when data provided by a web client is used immediately by server-side scripts to generate results for that user. And a cross-site scripting flaws occurs every time that an application takes user-supplied data and sends it to a web browser without first confirming or encoding the data. To locate cross-site scripting attacks, you should look for lines in the web server log that contain JavaScript or other scripting languages that forward a user section cookie to an external location or a web page. A buffer overflow occurs when an invalid amount of input is written to the buffer area. A SQL injection occurs when an attacker inputs actual database commands into the database input field instead of the valid input. You should include input validation to prevent SQL injection attacks. Path traversal occurs when the / characters are entered into the URL to traverse directories that are not supported, supposed to be to be available from the web. Some possible countermeasures to input validation attacks include the following. 1. Filter out all known malicious requests. 2. Validate all information coming from the client, both at the client level and at the server level. And 3. Implement a security policy that includes parameter checking in all web applications. Another application issue that you need to understand is clickjacking. Clickjacking is a technique that is used to trick user into revealing confidential information or taking over the user's computer when clicking links. Often, you will need to determine the attack vector used. Reverse engineering is the best way to do this. When designing a web application, security should be one of the facets that you should always keep in mind. An application should be secure by design, by default, and by deployment. Secure by design means that the application is designed with security in mind. Secure by default means that the application defaults to be secure without changing application settings. And secure by deployment means that the environment into which the application is deployed is taken into consideration from a security standpoint. For the CySA Plus exam, you also need to understand exploits that all cause security issues with identity and access management. For example, impersonation. Attackers may try to impersonate a legitimate user to obtain access credentials. Identity proofing is mitigation for this type of attack, like multi-factor authentication, for example, right? Man in the middle, MITM, as it's usually known, this attack occurs when an attacker intercepts messages between two devices and eavesdrop on the communication. The attacker attempts to impersonate each party using one-time passwords and mutual authentication or mitigation for this attack. Session hijack. This attack occurs when an attacker attempts to take over a session that is already occurring. Encryption is a mitigation for this type of attack. And rootkit is a set of software tools that allow an attacker to gain control of a device. The best mitigation is to remove all rootkits. Question 39. Your organization's management has recently spent time discussing attacks against companies and their infrastructure. During the meeting, the Stuxnet attack was discussed. Against which type of system did this attack occur? The correct answer is B, SCADA. A Stuxnet attack occurs against a supervisory control and data acquisition, the SCADA system. A SCADA system is also referred to as an industrial control system. SCADA is a category of software that gathers data in real time from remote locations to control equipment and conditions. It is used to monitor critical systems and control of power distribution. In recent years, it has become even more vital to protect these systems. SCADA is used in the power, oil, telecommunications, gas refining, water treatment, nuclear facilities, and waste control industries. SCADAs and ICS are types of building automation systems. Kerberos is an authentication system that includes clients such as client service in a key distribution or KDC center. The KDC gives clients tickets that the clients use to access service and other resources. Remote authentication dial-in user server or radius is a remote access technology that allows remote users to centrally sign on to access the resources on the local network. And voice over IP is technology that allows voice communication to be routed over an IP network. Question 40, and the last of this batch of questions. During the investigation of a network breach, you locate evidence that someone from outside the network was sending packets with a SYN flag on the TCP header. Which of the following operation is the malicious individual attempting? The correct answer is B, service discovery. The individual is attempting service discovery, which is the process of identifying whether a service is operational on a device and whether the service is protected by a firewall. By sending a TCP SYN packets and analyzing the responses, the attacker can make inferences about these two issues. For example, if the TCP SYN packet receives no response, the device is either filtered or located behind a firewall that is blocking that port number or IP address. If the TCP SYN packet receives a SYN ACK packet in return, then the device is reachable, the port is open, and the service is available. If the TCP SYN packet receives an RST packet in return, then the device is reachable, but the port is closed and the service is not available. This is not a denial of service attack. A DOS attack attempts to make the host or its resources unavailable. Service discovery does not do that. And this is not a DNS harvesting attack either, because a DNS harvesting attack attempts to obtain the entire DNS records from DNS server, typically by convincing the server to perform an unauthorized zone transfer. This is not an email harvesting attack, because in an email harvesting attack, an attempt is made to obtain large numbers of email addresses and uses a variety of approaches to do so, including through social engineering, by buying lists from other spammers or criminals, by accessing the emails and address books in other users' computer, and by hacking websites, among other techniques. All right, so we have come to the conclusion of this part 4 of the CySA Plus Domain 1 Threat and Vulnerability Management. Next, we will go over questions in part 5 of this domain.